This is a really amazing event, and I would like to welcome everybody. Perhaps for the first time ever, researchers from all over the world have come together on this topic, on the topic of media ownership and concentration in their country. Amazing people, an amazing group of people coming here together on this common project. They have developed in a very methodical way information about their country. We're still in the middle of this project, the early middle, not the end. They have developed information that is usually quite unique and innovative for their own countries. So if we had done nothing else, generating such work around the world would be already very satisfying. But on top of it, we also want to develop and identify overarching information trends, drivers, impacts, and more. And this data that they have developed now as a common pool is now also a resource for all of them. We have a wiki. We are a wiki. It seems to be working. And we believe that this study and its progeny will affect media research, media policy, media management, and in many countries. So I'd like to welcome you in behalf of the Columbia University. Yes, this is how it looked, but 10 days ago. The Columbia Business School, the Columbia Institute for Teleinformation, and on behalf of the organizing executive committee of this event, my co-conspirators, who I'd like kind of to salute for their participation. They manage their countries, their regions. I kind of manage the region, their coordination, and Inho Lee, who's outside, manages me. So this is basically the structure that we have. We have a wiki. It is managed by Joost van Groenen and now by Helmut Müller. Now all of us are meeting here for the first time. Many of us have never met before. Together we have a wonderful team of perhaps 30 countries and more, and still counting. And thanks to the CIPI team here, which has organized this. Again, we have here the names, but in particular Inho Lee outside, who has been holding this together administratively. We also want to thank our new partner, the Open Society Institute, Open Society Foundation, the media program. They have joined us as partners a week ago. And much of it is due to Marius Dragomir, who we kind of want to thank. The program is headed by Gordana Jankovic, and we also want to thank the president, Ari Nair. Many of you have heard of OSI and its role in helping creating democratic institutions in Eastern Europe after the fall of totalitarianism and repression. And among these institutions, a free press was central, and then it expanded its role around the world. The nice thing about OSI and its media program is not that they just support funding. Thank you for that, though. That's nice. But they also engage in studies themselves or are a catalyst for them, such as this as an example. So let me now turn to with thanks to you, the audience, thanks to the team members from whom we will hear during this event, and the other organizers, thank you very much. And we'll perhaps hear Patrick next.
You can speak from here if you don't have a presentation.
Okay. Thank you very much. First, we have to thank very much Elinoam and to congratulate him for organizing this meeting. We start about 1 year ago for this project. When we had the opportunity to welcome Elinoma as a doctor honoris causa of Aix-Marseille University in France. It is for me a great pleasure and honor to participate to this introduction. And I will be very brief, only to underline the fact that to advance in this project, Elinoma has developed a great energy, faced to the difficulties to define a methodology, to organize the network, to produce the wiki, to establish his team with different people. And also it has been a real difficulty to manage the whole consortium with different parts of researchers around the world. So energy, difficulties, and now I think we are faced to a true scientific challenge, which is to continue to advance and to establish this methodology at the world level. Answering to a question some of our colleagues asked me yesterday, I think probably like a celeb poet, we are working, we are defining our way. I am sure that at the end of this today, our way will be clear and we will average an interesting step to continue together in a friendly way and in an excellent scientific perspective. Thank you very much.
Okay, Kiyoshi Nakamura, Waseda University.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to express my sincere gratitude, appreciation for Professor Elie Noem who give us opportunity to join this global scale study group. As Professor Noem already suggested, media concentration and ownership are extremely important in any country because digital revolution causes the convergence of telecommunication, broadcasting, and computer technologies. And now the nearly limitless news and information are available on the internet. So that in Japan, other Asian countries are not immune from this situation. For many years, the television and newspapers were pretty much the only important sources of information for the most Japanese, but the business model of TV broadcasting and newspapers is dying because of the mass audience has been splintered into niches. So it is extremely important for us to discuss how new media has been affecting media market structure and market conduct, and also how it has been changing the media concentration as a whole. So, but I must say that the most important thing is that the discussion must be based on the evidence. So I hope that this is a place for us to exchange the evidence and to deepen our mutual understanding. Thank you very much.
Marius Dragomir of OSI.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for inviting us here, and I have to say that it is an honor for us to be able to support this project and to be part of it. I want to say just 2 words about the Open Society Institute. This is a grant-making organization which is fully supported from the funds of a single person, and that person is George Soros. The Open Society Institute is covering issues such as judicial capacity, women's rights, minorities' rights, and a large division of the Open Society Institute is the media program. The media program, which is based in London, the media hub, I would say, of the Open Society Institute is based in London, and is dealing with several key issues. It's making grants in fields such as journalism training and media literacy. We have a lot of interest in supporting investigative journalism across the world. And we also have a large portfolio covering freedom of expression. The last on the list, but not the smallest and the growing department of the Open Society Institute media program is the Research and Advocacy department. And I will speak more about how we work and with whom we work, in what countries we work during the next panel. the mandate of the Open Society Institute and of the media program at the OSI is global. We work in over 50 countries worldwide. We have a network of local foundations in most of the Eastern European countries. We have regional foundations across Africa and offices in the US and Asia and Latin America. I just want to say that to end by stressing that ownership and concentration of ownership has been high on the agenda of the media program. We have run several in-house research projects where the ownership and lack of transparency over the ownership in Eastern Europe has been discussed, debated, and researched. And besides this in-house research, we really try to team up and support and outsource research to various organizations, as it is the case now with Columbia University. We are running now a global project looking into digital media, about which I will say more during the day. And we have a section in this global project looking at the changes in patterns of media ownership triggered by the transition to digitization. I think that's it for now. Thank you again for inviting us, and I look forward to this cooperation.
Thank you very much.
Let's ask our first panel, which would be Ben Compagnie, Marius Radimir, Phil Napoli, Ron Rice, Adam Jira, and Tim Wu to join us. Ellie is going to be chairing this panel. So we need a few extra chairs in here. Got some name tag cards here. 15, if we could limit 15 minutes would be great. I'll keep time for Ben. You should take a seat next to Put you here. Phil. You can stay up there, Ellie.
Yeah, no, I have.
You want to sit here? You want to sit here?
Oh, did I do this?
We gotta get 16.
I'll be happy to sit over there.
Yeah, well, why don't you come up here? Ellie's gonna sit on the end here. That's chair. He's just the chair.
Just back and see what this is.
But I'm also the, I will also provide a little summary presentation as soon as this microphone is live. All right. I'd like to connect the dots. We have lots of dots here now. I think you want to kind of also to hear where is this leading to, at least kind of a taste. The basic question before us, are the world's media becoming more concentrated or what? And if so, does it make a difference, and so on? And the answer to that question, to which many people know the answer, is actually more complicated. Of course, we know that large media firms are becoming larger. We read the newspapers. But at the same time, there are new entrants, growing industry, new types of media, especially the internet, and greater cross-border openness. And so this issue has been in the United States an issue of considerable public interest and debate. When the FCC tried to change the rules a few years ago, it got over 1 million letters of people protesting, and they came from the activist left, but also from the activist right, and also from the activist center. And people kind of took strong positions. The noted social scientist Michael Moore said, for example, that there would be five people control the world media. More academic person type, Larry Lessig, talked about 3 companies controlling most of it. But there's the other perspective, Adam Thierer of the Progress and Freedom Foundation, and formerly Cato, who was going to be on this panel. Unfortunately, he had to cancel. He wrote a book about suggesting there was the opposite, that he says, and I quote, To the extent that there was ever a golden age of media in America, we are living in it today. The media sky has never been brighter, getting brighter with each passing year. And this is most definitely not a case of looking for silver linings around the clouds. There are no clouds. And the basic summary here is it's the internet. And so the combination of the Googles and the Dings and the Skypes and the YouTubes and so on is just opening up everything, and traditional media. Now, both sides in this debate see themselves as protecting democracy, either from the heavy-handed megalomaniacal proprietors or from flat-footed government bureaucrats. And both sides see themselves as holding the line, digital Thermopylae against the barbarians at the gate. Now, are the Cassandras or the Pollyannas correct? This would seem to be an empirical question, and for such an investigation of such globalized industry as media, the international dimension is really important. Media concentration is not just an American subject, it's everywhere. Whether you look at Italy or Australia or Mexico, Brazil, and on and on. I mean, even Iceland. I was a few years ago, a while ago, I was in Iceland. President Grimson, he's the guy on the right. Just that week, he had vetoed a media ownership law. It was the first veto in the history of the Republic of Iceland. It led by constitution to a public referendum. And interestingly, to put this in context, it was the political right that advocated control over ownership. It was the political left that that opposed controls. Why? Because the media conglomerate in question that was supposed to be contained was supporting the political left. So there are, in many debates here, there's some opportunism on top of the principle involved. So the various country reports and developments are really interesting. We'll hear about them in the next 2 days. Regulatory fights, moguls, battles for corporate control, influence over societies, over millions of people, their minds and pocketbooks and hearts. But this itself is very, very important and very interesting. But I also want to add some empirical work that we just did literally in the last 3 or 4 days with the help of those 4 people who visited us from Germany, who sit somewhere. Where are you guys? Anybody here? Okay.
They're working.
All right. Okay. And we thank them. So take a look at some of the examples of how we can use this information. On the timelines of media concentration. See, part of the problem, of course, is you've got many countries, and we're still in the middle of the work, and you see Israel up there at the top, and you see the United States down there at the bottom. But if you kind of average it out now, just because I have only 5 minutes or so, is that the for television concentration, on the horizontal axis is the date, on the vertical axis is the extent of concentration as defined by the Herfindahl-Hirschman index, HHI. 10,000 is totally concentrated, 0 is totally unconcentrated. You can see that the trends kind of on the average weighted by population is going up. Just a regular average seems to have a bit of a U shape. In the 90s it's going down, then it kind of is coming up again. That's for television broadcasting. For newspapers, it seems to be fairly steadily creeping up, and I bet the last 2 years or so have accelerated that trend. For wireless kind of cell phones, by population, it seems to be fairly stable. On the other hand, weighted by population, the average kind of declined in the first year, then it goes flat. Averaged by population, it seems to be fairly flat, which means that the bigger countries had less concentration than the smaller countries, and the smaller countries kind of fell in line later. When it comes to wireline, the classic telecom industry, there seems to be from an extraordinarily high concentration in the 8,000 and 7,000 range. It's been coming down, still fairly high, 5,000, 6,000, but certainly the trend has been downwards. When it comes to the internet service, you can see here that it's been kind of one could probably characterize this, with the exception of that kind of weird dot there in the middle, which I can explain, but I won't have time for. It's not an error. Is that you have a bit of a U shape. That in the 90s, concentration in the internet service industry declined, and then kind of somewhere around 2000, it kind of started to creep up again, probably around the time in which broadband became more important, in which the dot-com bust occurred. This is all interesting, but at least as interesting to me is the correlations of these concentration indices with some indicators of other things in economics, in technology, in social developments. And I think in some ways, let me kind of give me a minute to report this. So for example, if you correlate, and these are very simple correlations, just kind of back of the envelope, we didn't have time for series data analysis, multivariate and so on. If you look at horizontally the TV broadcasting concentration, you see that it is associated with declining government effectiveness. Now, I'm not saying which is the cause and which is the effect, but statistically there's a correlation. If you look at the ISP concentration and government effectiveness, a similar trend. If you look at the impact of television broadcasting with democracy, the further down you are, the less democracy, there's an association. If you look at the association of ISP concentration with a freedom index, where bad is up, there's also a correlation that is troublesome. If you look at the Freedom House correlation index, then you also see a kind of a negative problematic association. If you look at regulatory quality, again, kind of, don't ask me who defined it and how, but let's just kind of live with that index. You also have a negative correlation. If you look at the regulatory quality in ISP, you have a negative correlation. If you look at ISP concentration and corruption, where corruption is at the bottom, you also have a negative correlation. When you look at the corrupt efforts against corruption, corruption control, you also have a troublesome correlation. If you look at the, let me kind of skip a little bit. Now, what about the impact of concentration on technology? Research and development spending per capita, the more concentrated for television broadcasting, the less R&D there seems to be. And again, I'm not suggesting a causal effect, but a statistical correlation, and I'm also mindful that we don't have that many data, so everything has to be kind of considered with some caution. If you look at the at ISP, you also have a negative correlation. If you look at something called the Digital Access Index, you have a fairly pronounced negative correlation. If you look at it kind of at ISP concentration and the extent of internet usage, you also have a negative correlation. So you can see I'm just kind of keep giving you associations that are troublesome. Now, I'm not saying that these are the only correlations and so on, but these are the ones that kind of leap to the eye. Now, when we look at economics, well, we know the economy is bad, has been bad, and the decline in the economic growth in the year 2008 was correlated negatively with concentration. In 2009, everything is kind of further down, also a negative correlation, at least for this one was wireless, wireline. Interestingly, however, with ISPs, it seems the more concentrated the ISP industry is, the better the countries are doing economically. Okay, you figure that one out. Same here, so same correlation was true for 08 and 09. Now, coming to the kind of last 3 or so slides. When it comes to happiness, there's something, somebody has a national happiness index. Okay, and it turns out that the more concentrated the industries are, the unhappier it seems the population is. This is for the newspapers. However, this is kind of, I also want to kind of to put on the record that the more concentrated television broadcasting is, the happier the country seems to be. Okay, and the more concentrated the the wider line, that is the telecom industry, is, the happier the country seems to be also. And the same true holds also for the ISP. So to conclude, there's very preliminary results, but kind of, I think it gives us a little bit of a sense of where we are in these different countries. Media concentration associated with poor government, less democracy, less freedom, more corruption, less effective regulation, lower R&D, lower economic growth, lower digital access. But at the same time, we also observe that these preliminary findings also show that media concentration is often associated with greater happiness in the country. We really need to figure this out, ladies and gentlemen. So maybe we should add some behavioral scientists, psychologists, and so on to this study, also in addition to economists and media scholars. Thank you very much. I will now resume my role as the chairman. And we'll recognize, perhaps just kind of in the order in which we are sitting here, Ben Compain. Let me just say that I will not, I will not introduce people. I will just say Ben Compain has written an important book, among many other things, but has written an important book called Who Owns the Media, that kind of went to a first and then a second edition. That was kind of, when it comes to numbers, kind of one of the major contributions, perhaps the major contributions in this field. Ben.
Thank you, Ellie. I'm going to get to some of these slides that you showed in a minute, and because they illustrate some of the issues that I really wanted to talk about. If you've looked at Ellie's book, which really replaces Who Owns the Media, we just don't need another edition of it, and so thank you for taking this burden on you. Ellie, in talking about the pessimists and the optimists, and looking at the past, what people have said in the debate, after talking about the pessimists, the McChesneys and the Bagdickians, he says, I now turn to the views of the media optimists, where he includes me later on, who see an abundance of openness and diversity. And then you have to read Ellie's footnotes. I recommend that, because they're important. The footnote to that statement that says most of it is libertarian or free market in orientation says, that is not widespread in academia. One graduate student at another university wrote about me, Ellie, after what I hope was a balanced presentation, quote, most interesting to me was the idea that there is even a school of thought that disagrees with the alarmist view towards media concentration. And for, I think, many of us in academia, that's the prevailing starting point. As co-editor of the journal Media Economics, and having lived in this world for more than 30 years of media ownership studies, I can't tell you the number of conversations that start with something like, or a paper, an academic paper, that starts with something like, well, it's given that we've had increased media ownership, concentration of ownership. And I've been seeing this for 30-some years. And that would suggest that the outcome is that today we only have one owner of everything. Because if we kept having increased ownership for those 30 or 40 years, there'd be nothing left, because they were alarmist back then. So my question is, and by the way, I started in that same place. Of course the media is concentrated. In 1978, I was working for a publishing company in White Plains, and someone from CBS came to us and said, the Federal Trade Commission in the US is going to have a symposium on media ownership. Could you put together some data on this? So we wrote a book, put together a book called Who Owns the Media. And what came out of that book was that it was a much more mixed bag. That in some areas, yes, in some areas, no. It just was not a universal, yes, the media is more concentrated. That was my introduction to the notion of, let's look at the data and figure out what this means. Why do we get a mixed message? Now, Ellie just didn't show a completely mixed message, but he was also showing correlations, which correlations don't necessarily show direction. He was just showing OEC data, which may or may not be typical of other places. And he was using it against indexes like happiness, and we don't really know where that came from, or any of these other things. Who put those together? And that's part of what I see from my perspective, that why do we get such mixed messages from Ellie's book and so much of the research? For one, the answer depends on what questions you ask. And years ago, when I was still a young lad, my father was in the toy business. He owned a couple of toy stores. And I remember asking him once, I said, are you profitable? Simple question. And he said, well, my accountant comes in at the end of each year and he says, how much money do you have to pay taxes? And then the implication, he would set the profitability to fit the amount of money my father had to pay taxes. Now, if you know accounting, this doesn't necessarily mean dishonesty. I mean, there are a lot of things about depreciation and when you account for certain things that you can sometimes have discretion. So I'm not suggesting that it was an Enron, but the fact is, it depends on what question we ask. It also depends on what methodology is employed. Are you using just plain correlation, or using some regression analysis, and what are you putting in there? The answers, of course, sometimes depend on who's doing the asking. What do they want to be the answer? And the implications of the findings, I find, are often in the eyes of the beholder. That is, in looking at a lot of academic papers, I see the research going one way, and the conclusion, the findings are, sometimes very different. Sometimes they just ignore the stuff they don't like. And the bottom line, the part that people read in the journal article, is the conclusion, which may not be totally accurate. Let me give you an example of a study that we're about to publish. And this, again, goes to some of what Ellie was showing. The question was, does ownership matter in the presentation of TV news at the local station level in the U.S.? Does who own, does the situation of the local station matter? The research said that, well, if you ask the question, do locally owned stations provide more local news than stations that are owned and operated by the big networks and or are duopoly owned, two stations in the same market? The answer to that question turns to be yes, that locally owned stations provided more local news than those that were owned and operated by the networks or duopoly. But if you ask the question, do owned and operated or duopoly stations provide more total news? The answer there is yes. So, which finding do you want to use? Then we asked the author to incorporate market level data. He was just looking at stations, regardless of whether it was a big market, small market, lots of competition. We asked him to add in market level data and do a regression on that. So we looked at market size, the total number of stations in the market, the number of stations that the groups owned. And you know what happened? He found that everything was reversed. That on that basis, locally owned stations provided more total news but less local news when accounting for these market factors, and the O&Os and duopolies provided more local news. So what conclusion do you want to take from that? You can find almost anything in there. And then what wasn't even touched is, what about the quality of the news? Does that matter? How do you figure that out? Do you have, in locally owned news, do you have a lot of man-bite-dog stories, which, who really cares about another fire on 43rd Street? Or maybe there are fewer local stories, but maybe they're more substantive. We don't know. And what I too often see, because it's much easier to measure the amount of news, in this case, or the amount of something, it's much harder to measure the quality of it. I see very little research on the quality, and sometimes you've got to balance that stuff out. Another example of the mixed messages. A couple of years ago, the Project for Excellence in Journalism did a really excellent study. And they were looking at also the ownership of local TV stations and what that meant. And I've written about this before. Some of the findings were very counterintuitive, and some of them went against probably what they expect. For example, they found that stations with cross-ownership, that they own a newspaper and magazine, or a newspaper maybe and a TV station, in which the parent company also owns a newspaper in the same market, those stations tended to produce higher quality newscasts. But the ownership type, no matter what kind of ownership, had no measurable difference in the terms of diversity of the people depicted in the news, and little difference in the range of topics of things covered. They found that stations owned by the largest groups provided higher quality early morning newscasts, early evening newscasts, than those owned by small groups. But the smaller station groups tended to produce higher quality late evening newscasts. Now, why? I don't know. I mean, these are just artifacts? Do they really mean something? So again, you can find anything you want. One of my favorite sayings is, I've never seen a pancake so thin it doesn't have two sides. Harry Truman, US President, famously once said, someday I'd like to meet a one-handed economist. But my take, I even have a blog called that, though I haven't got a pancake. I find that from economic academic research tends to focus on things like mergers and consolidation, but I see very little research on why and when there are divestitures and deconsolidation. Adam Thierry, if he had been here, has talked a lot about that. We see big headlines about Comcast and NBC want to merge, but we pay far less attention, and it sort of makes sort of the back page when Time Warner spins off its whole big cable division, which was a huge part of Time Warner, and makes it into a separate company. Not to mention the AOL merger, which got, as we know, great press, big press, and its spin-off, a little thing. So those things have to be taken into consideration. I also find the academic researchers tend to be playing catch-up on the technology, especially. They're always fighting the last war. By they, I mean most of us. It's taken a long time to figure out that Apple is a player in the music business. It's taken a long time to figure out that Comcast and a lot of the other big cable companies have become major programmers in competition with the old networks and studios. We're coming to grips with the fact that Google is involved in everything. And maybe that's good, maybe that's bad. One of the things I always am promoting is to try taking a contrarian position or ask the question differently than what's expected. For example, one of the most common questions is, does the ownership of the media drive media bias? Is there a bias because News Corp owns the Wall Street Journal now, or because some group buys a local newspaper? A couple years ago, there's a wonderful study that I hope you've come across called What Drives Media Slant. They didn't use the word bias because that might bias. What Drives Media Slant by Genskow and Shapiro, two economists. It was great because they did a content analysis of 80% of the newspaper content, of the content of 80% of the circulation of newspapers. It wasn't just a couple issues from a couple of newspapers. They used a computer-driven algorithm that made a lot of sense, and I won't go into that. Check the study. Their key finding is that, what would you expect? That what's the normal reaction is that he who owns the newspaper, or she who owns the newspaper, helps determine the content. 3 minutes. We're good. Their key finding was that using zip code level data on newspaper circulation, they showed that right-wing newspapers circulate relatively more in zip codes with high fractions of Republicans. And by implications that newspapers that are less identified with blue states, with more liberal areas, tend to be more liberal. And in fact, further study found that newspaper companies with publications in multiple markets follow the same principle, that their papers in red markets, to use that phrase, tended to be slightly more conservative, and the newspapers in the blue markets tend to be a little more slanted to the liberals. What that is saying is that it's the market that drives it, that if you're publishing a market in a relatively conservative city, you tend to more or less reflect your market. It's not that the owner is telling them what to say. Now, we can discuss that. My point here is that sometimes you've got to look beyond the obvious and do research that goes beyond the usual questions. As policymakers, you need to understand what's behind acquisitions or divestitures, what's behind mergers and startups and regulatory changes, not just what is. We've got to keep up with the changing technology landscape. We can't be fighting the old media battles. And we have to see why context is most important to policy. Let's see what I should end with. Well, there are two groups of researchers. There are social scientists who tend to do a lot of mass comm, effects of users. There are the economists who look at the effects on institutions and free markets or not. I think policymakers need to be informed by both. We have to look at the economics and say, well, what are the social consequences? But we've got to look at the social side and say, well, are there economic reasons why some of this stuff might make sense? So I've been involved in this for 30 years, more than 30 years. When I started looking at that, we had 3 TV networks, a handful of newspapers in my town, 15 cable channels. Today I look around and I say, am I better off? Do I have more choices, more diverse choices than I had 30 years ago, or even 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago? And just personally, which gets me out of the realm of data, I've got to look around and I say, I don't want to go back to anything that I've seen in the past.
Thank you very much, Ben. I will now. We're just going to wander down this aisle here. Tim Wu, again, you have the bio. In addition to being a distinguished professor at the Columbia Law School, my colleague here at Columbia, and in addition of being one of Harvard's 100 most influential graduates, which is pretty kind of tough group to be admitted to. He's also the chairman of the media reform organization Free Press, which for those of you from other countries is one of the major, if not the major media organizations advocating change in media. So he's an advocate and an academic. Tim.
Thanks. You think there's any chance I could use the blackboard?
Sure.
Speak
Aaron, keep the screen.
academic more comfortable with the blackboard.
You actually want chalk?
Yes. No mind picking that up. Well, let me start. First of all, I can't imagine a better topic. I want to thank everyone for coming from so far. Thank Ellie for holding this. I mean, you can't imagine a better, more interesting, more complicated, nuanced topic than media concentration. And I'm very honored to be here and able to talk about this. I want to spend my time addressing a single question, which I think is a really interesting topic. One that was very important in the 1940s, but has somewhat, I think, in my opinion, has waned. You may feel differently. Which is I want to discuss whether we are more concerned about some types of media concentration than other types. I want to see whether there are, I think it's important for academics and regulators to distinguish between different types of concentration and have a sense of whether the problem, if there is one, is concentration period, or whether there are forms of concentration or different types of industry structures that we care more about, care less about, and so forth. All right, so I need a chalkboard to make this point clear. Can I have the other? I guess I need this now. Can I move this one up there?
I think there was some difficulty.
See, I actually know, so I know how to work with it. Silly. So, what I'm going to talk about is all of what you might call the information industry. So I'm not limited to newspapers or something. I'm talking about every industry that moves information. Most industries that move information tend to have 3 layers. It's a little bit of a simplification, but we generally have some kind of content layer, some kind of transport layer, and some kind of exhibition or tool layer, or sometimes it's called CPE or. You can see these, in the film industry, this will be production, distribution, and theaters. In the internet, this is content, and then movement, and then computers. And so we've seen over the years, in the research I've been doing lately, I've been interested in forms that the information industries have taken basically since the telegraph till today. And what you end up with is a number of sort of classic forms. One, it looks like this. And in the United States, it has a name, AT&T, where you have a single monopoly, vertically integrated. There's some trivial, there was always some sort of trivial competition, but not for this diagram, you can simplify it. You have a monopolist, totally vertically integrated, controls the whole industry. Another very common pattern that you saw over time is a series of vertically integrated, maybe 3 or 4 completely vertically integrated players who control, don't control the whole industry, but control every aspect within their own vertical control. So the classic model here is the Hollywood studios. Paramount, Warner Brothers, control all the way up and down the line. And then you have some variations where, and you continue to have these kind of variations where you have some concentration at one layer, and then a slightly more deconcentrated versions of other layers. Now, I want to associate this in particular with at some stage of its development, this is where the internet was, and in some ways still is. Let's say the 1990s internet, where you had thousands, in the United States, thousands of internet service providers. A thousand relative, some actors who are more concentrated in the middle, like search engines, Yahoo, and so forth, Google increasingly, and then thousands of potential sites for content. And then other variations on this where you might have, this is more like, perhaps like the internet looks like today, more concentrated here, and then still, I'm not saying these are fully concentrated, but more concentrated, and very unconcentrated on the content layer. And what I think is an interesting question is, oh, and then finally another, sorry, I forgot the last one I want to talk about. Now this is a difficult one to draw in this diagram. I'm just going to call it conglomerate model. And what's happening in the conglomerate model, and to some extent the internet models too, which can be very confusing to understand, is the idea of a company like Warner Communications starting in the 1970s, which deliberately began to own unrelated media properties. So when you look at Warner Communications, headed by Stephen Ross in the 1970s, he owned a funeral parlor. He started in a funeral parlor. He had a car rental company. He added a film studio. He added to that DC Comics. He had the Franklin Mint. He had the New York Cosmos soccer team. He had just a wild collection of media properties and non-media properties, all kind of thrown together. It's also kind of a confusing thing for people who want to talk about concentration in media industries. Are you talking about concentration when you have an enormous company, a gigantic company, but it only half its property are media properties, or it owns media properties, but none of them are what you might call competing, or only some of them are competing with the film industry, and it kind of, what do you say about that? So these are some of the forms I've taken, and I'm limited by a two-dimensional diagram does not really do justice to the two-dimensional diagram doesn't do justice to the forms that are available. But I think it's very important to understand or focus on the different forms that concentration might take, because I do think they lead to very fundamentally different speech and innovation environments. Now, if we were having this conference in 1916 or something, we'd probably all be talking about how this was obviously the best form to do anything. That that 1916, not 1960, that the monopolist was the future, that maybe even through the 30s, I think we might have had this kind, depending on who was in the room. They're very innovative. You have Bell Labs being funded so wonderfully. You have perfect control over every aspect. You have a remarkable efficiency based on this system. But I think that today we have a distrust of the effects of this kind of system. I mean, I think it's sort of obvious to point out the reason we're having this conference is people have some doubts about this kind of structure. And I'd say today we've begun to idealize something that looks more like this, or sometimes I would say, someone like McChesney, or in fact a group like Free Press, which I chair, has idealized something like this, which we've almost never seen in history. But the only time you might, I should have put this on here, the only time you might have seen this maybe is like 1920s radio in the United States, in the USA. So this might be idealized by some people in the room. Or I think if you are a company like, if you are a believer in Google, if you talk to their executives or founders, what they idealize is something roughly like this. Is they believe in a layer, I would suggest a layer cake model of industry concentration. They believe that it's helpful to have some parts of the industry be extremely efficient, almost perfect in their own little way, like the search engine, and have a single search engine. They're not concerned about the fact that they're a monopoly. People are rarely concerned about the fact that they're a monopoly. but they are people who ideologically would sort of like to associate themselves with this, but they say, well, you need to have some of the efficiency of scale that comes from a single search engine. It'd be crazy to have a million search engines. They're not opposed to it, but they do think it runs better with them running some certain things. And then that almost allows us to flourish. There's a theory, and I think kind of I wouldn't say they've been explicit about it, but what I think that Google believes is that concentration layered concentration can be a good thing for maximizing diversity in other layers. So I think they believe that if you have concentration here, as I'm saying, concentration at some layers, it can help out other layers. Amazon might suggest that too. Amazon would say, well, us organizing and putting together all the world's books is actually better for the amount of books that people are able to get to. Right. So there's theories out there which haven't been fully developed as to the relationship between different layers of concentration and non-concentration. Well, what do I think? My own views are that I think, and I'm willing to accept that many people may disagree with me. I tend to be more suspicious, and this is why I was saying my views are something like people believed in the other points in history, that we should be more concerned about vertical integration than straight up horizontal concentration. This is my own particular view on it. And that is simply because the old view that there are inherent conflicts of interest in vertical situations. That is to say, once you have a stake in content, or you have a stake in transportation, you're tended to become more corrupted in the decisions you'll make in other places, generally speaking. Now, there's a whole long debate on when that happens and when that doesn't happen, open platform, closed platform. The net neutrality debate has basically been centered on this. But I tend to believe that you will have reasons to want to inhibit innovation at the CPE layer, or inhibit or filter what kind of content you want when you have a stake in other markets. So my particular feeling, my general message to people here is I think we should be interested or start to have an opinion as to what kind of media concentration we care about, because I think you can almost define the era. If you what you really care about is speech and innovation. This was the film studios in the 1930s, and American film in the 30s, 40s, 50s has a feeling which is different than the conglomerate feeling, and it's very directly related to its industry structure. So when you're picking which of these you like, and it's regulators who are often in the position to pick, essentially. I mean, obviously, corporate entities are also deciding themselves, but the feeling and the regulation as to what is a good idea changes the environment we live in. So I think it's important to develop an idea of what we think is the right idea. And I, as I said, tend to, maybe I'm brainwashed or something, but tend to have some belief that a layer cake model has some appeal and tend to be most suspicious of vertical integration. All right, thank you very much.